What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, first in the series that includes this game and Shadow of War, which together are mostly known for their Nemesis system. But before we get into all that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But to that end, the 100% for this one was weird in a number of ways, not least of which because I originally played the bulk of this all the way back when the game launched in 2014. Well before I even had a YouTube channel, as a matter of fact. But following on from that, sometime later they released several DLCs. I had bought one of them at the time, Lord of the Hunt, but I never bought the Bright Lord DLC, and there was an achievement I was missing for the base game, which I obviously went back and got for the sake of gathering footage and covering it on the channel here. But believe it or not, that's not the only thing either. So when this game launched, it initially had an online system that has since been shut down. My understanding is that the one for Shadow of War is still active, but at the time they shut the servers down, there were actually achievements and stuff that required it, but they updated the game to not need that online component anymore, meaning that you could still 100% it anyway. However, with the servers shut down, the old leaderboards are completely gone for some of the trial stuff that we'll get into, and you can't do any of the old online missions anymore, so something to know, I suppose. But really the main thing to mention there is the Nemesis Forge. We're about to talk about what that system is, but at one time it was possible to take your Nemesis from this first game and bring it into the second game. That no longer exists, even though the second game's online component is still active, I believe, but because it connected the two games and the old ones got shut down, that specific feature is no longer available in either of them. And so while I played this game all those years ago, we do have a little bit of stuff that was new to me in the form of the Bright Lord DLC. But obviously, the main thing there is to talk about with this game is in fact the Nemesis system, which got a patent, unfortunately, that has seen it used basically nowhere else, and it does keep these games unique at the very least. But the interesting thing about its implementation here in the first game is that you could almost say the first game is like a first draft, and the story serves mostly as a tutorial for the system itself, to the point where I would say if you don't like either Lord of the Rings, or you just don't care about it, or you don't like the Nemesis system, you probably won't like this game because everything else about it is pretty run-of-the-mill. If you've ever played a stealth action game, you pretty much get the gist other than those two features, basically. Now, let's get on to the rest of this, starting with the technical state. How is this game running all the way in 2026? Honestly, perfectly fine. It had a few frame rate dips on me here and there, especially when I would load into a new area, but that would really be about it. Other than that, ran perfectly good, no crashes, anything like that, which I do think is slightly noteworthy just because this game is kind of on the cusp of the era at which games tend to start having problems with newer systems. But as it stands, this one seems perfectly fine. Moving on a bit, this game has one set difficulty, so that is a bit of a problem, I think, at times, because oftentimes the game is very, very easy. The only thing you would get approaching any change at all to the base difficulty, which again is very mild, would be the Trials of War, one of the DLC features, in the sense that the other DLC for the game adds on to these trials that you can undertake, which then have special qualifiers you have to meet. Other than that, the game really has no specific requirement of challenging you in any specific way outside of what the game has to offer with its basics. Which then brings us to the story of this one. The first thing I want to mention right here is, for starters, I am going to be spoiling a bit of the story here simply because it's not very long and it would be hard not to. But the other side of that is actually that it's important to understand with this first game especially, most of the story is a big tutorial for the Nemesis system. Most of the missions you slowly introduce concepts and things like that over the course of, if you're beelining it, maybe 10 hours. And while it does still have some strong moments here and there, overall it's just not a story that is super in-depth or anything. It also has to fit in the framework of the Lord of the Rings stuff, despite the fact that it's not a canon story anyway. Just because of how they wrote it, it has to, and for all those reasons and more, the story is likely not the reason you are playing this game specifically, and most of the actual main story just teaches you about the Nemesis system. Nonetheless, though, We play as Talion, a ranger stationed on the Black Gate right as the forces of Sauron start to rise again, and orcs and uruks storm the gate, kill basically everyone there, if not enslaving them, and you, Talion, watch your family get butchered right in front of you, only to find out that you have in fact been banished from death. And while the wraith that is accompanying you, it seems to imply it's a curse at first, just to get the spoiler out of the way, this wraith is actually Celebrimbor, the very elf who forged the Rings of Power. And while you cannot die, as anytime you do die, you will simply be resurrected at one of the towers a short time later, you can, however, use yours and Celebrimbor's power combined to take the fight to the orcs and basically engage in a giant guerrilla warfare campaign to slow them down as much as you possibly can while looking for the 3 specific servants of Sauron that killed your family: the Tower, the Hammer, and the Black Hand. Along the way, you're going to meet some other people like the rebel outcast leader Hergun, some people from the other area you'll be going to called the Sea of Nirnen, with your main goal there really just trying to set them up to be able to escape Mordor before things get any worse, because much of what the orc force has been doing has simply been capturing slaves and forcing them to build as Sauron preps his war machine. Again, all told, maybe a 10-hour story, with really the big focus being the Nemesis system. Which then brings us to the progression systems. They are a few, but they are relatively simple as well. First, you've got your runes and base upgrades that you'll be spending a currency, I believe it's called Mirin, on. This will upgrade things like your base health, focus, or the ability to slow down time when you draw your bow, the amount of shots you can take with your ethereal arrows, as well as adding runes to your 3 weapons, your sword, your dagger, and your bow. These runes allow you to slot runes into them, which then provide all sorts of different effects, typically based on the level of the orc you killed to get it. But because they shut down the servers for the distribution method for all of like the special runes that came with the different versions of the game, you'll have really great runes pretty much immediately. But as you butcher and murder your way across Mordor and complete quests and the like, you'll be gaining experience. This will give you ability points, which then alongside story progression allows you to increase your wraith and human abilities, making you that much more of a murder machine. On top of that, there is the power resource. So as you engage with the Nemesis system, again, we'll detail that here in a bit, you'll gain power from those interactions. That's important because you have to hit a certain power minimum to hit some of the upgrade tiers for your abilities. Some of that progression is also tied to story progression, meaning that you have to wait until specific story missions to be able to do it, such as branding orcs and forcing them to serve you. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section before we go all in on the Nemesis side of things. So, in a lot of ways, this game is very similar to many other games at the time, but especially now. It is a stealth action title. There are big towers called Forge Towers we'll find. Unlocking those opens up the surrounding map area, puts a bunch of map markers down for things like side missions, your main missions, challenges, artifacts, collectibles generally, basically, and you're going to hoover that stuff up, ideally, to get the resources to aid you in your progression. Now, some of those missions are more interesting than others, like for instance, for your 3 weapons, you can build their legend as you become a terror of Mordor. These are essentially challenges with each weapon type, and doing them will actually upgrade the visual appearance of your items. You can also pick up artifacts, which will give you some currency, and these also give you memories about people who used to live here. You can also rescue slaves from the orcs. Sometimes this will result in missions where you can then go and rescue more slaves from the orcs. It's probably also worth a mention that the base game, at least, is divided up into 2 areas, Udun and the Sea of Nirnen. Each of those areas individually is different from like a visual standpoint, yes, but also has 2 separate orc armies in each, which will be important in a moment. On top of that, outside of sneaking and moving your way around the world, which by the way is definitely on the clunky side, we also have the animal and wildlife. Now I actually remember this personally being a reason that I bought the game, because they marketed it quite a bit, was that the wildlife of Mordor plays a role in this whole situation, which is true. This was actually expanded by the Lord of the Hunt DLC, which I remember is actually why I bought that DLC specifically. But there are things like Caragors, Graugs, as well as Morgai flies, and you can interact with them initially by finding ways to dominate them and allow you to ride Caragors. Eventually you can ride Graug and use them in combat, but thanks to lures and environmental interactions within the orc camps themselves, you can also lure them into the camps, and they are not friends with the orcs or the uruks, and so they will be fighting each other often as well, and you can use that to your advantage at times. all while again sneaking and creeping your way through things, with the only real challenge to you likely coming from either a Graug or a captain or a war chief. But in terms of like general gameplay, that's basically it, which brings us finally to the Nemesis system. So in many ways, I would say this version is kind of a simpler first draft that they approached the sequel with, which goes much more in depth. Here it's a little on the basic side, but essentially the Nemesis system is all about the interactions of the orc leaders in a given area, as well as how much they deal with you. This culminates in a fight with your specific Nemesis, hence the name towards the end of the main story. Each army, again there are 2 of them, has 20 captains by default, as well as 5 war chiefs at any given time. When you die, time will advance, and interactions between these guys will resolve, resulting in promotions, deaths, duels, etc. And those interactions are really what a lot of the Nemesis system is about, both with them as well as you. Now, with them, they are fighting each other, typically in a Call the Weak sort of approach, where they are constantly fighting back and forth. This results in them often trying to kill each other without your involvement, but obviously we're going to get in there and meddle, which is what a lot of the story covers, with things like Ratbag showing you how some of this stuff can work. Basically, you can either help or hinder these guys on their way up the ranks, and plant little followers and deceivers in there to kind of make things go your way, especially when you can start branding orcs. Celebrimbor has the ability to basically dominate the will of these creatures and force them to serve you. Now, when you get to do that with the captains and the war chiefs, this allows you to set up other situations where you can either force them to attack each other, or you can use a bodyguard to turn on a war chief, for example, or you can simply turn the tide of a battle in the moment as you go to brand Uruks and things like that and keep yourself from dying, basically. Now, the catch there, though, is all of these guys have interactions with you, meaning that they are going to remember the things they said and did to you. Be that killing you, that will actually typically get them promoted. Usually spawns a vendetta mission as well, where you can go after them again. They also may encounter one of their fears, because all of these guys have strengths and weaknesses, or even things that they're just straight up afraid of, like say Caragors or Graugs, or simply being on fire as a result. And what this means is oftentimes these characters will have very memorable moments and back and forth with you, provided you aren't just massacring them super easily, because that's definitely an option. But say in a fight, you grabbed a random Uruk, threw him through a fire, and then they ran off and they managed to survive that encounter somehow. That character may well actually get promoted to be a captain at some point, and they are going to remember that you did that. If they kill you, they're going to remember that and gloat about it the next time you see them, things like that. And through all of those things, they will gain power and properties that make them a compelling character to actually fight against. So it's those interactions with other orcs, as well as their interactions with you and how you set those up, that make really memorable emergent moments that the system was hailed for and is still hailed for, because it's the only game that really does it, thanks to the patents and everything. And this is a system they doubled down on in Shadow of War, but made it more of an RPG thing, and so if you want to get the concept, it's still worth it to play this one. Now, all of this really comes into play with the second area. I'm not sure exactly how they choose this, but from the second army in the Sea of Nirn, once you actually start branding and dominating orcs and everything, the game is going to pick a nemesis for you. This is going to be a captain or a war chief that no matter how many times you kill them, they just won't seem to die. You're going to have multiple encounters with this character, and like many of these, is going to wind up seeing you constantly interrupted in combat, as they all insist on running up and having this big shout out to you, which stops combat and pauses it while you do it, which, by the way, if you're fighting like 4 or 5 captains at a time, gets real old real fast. Now, most of the time, this builds up like an encounter with this specific nemesis, but I will say this time, playing through it again to get this footage basically, I hilariously had a situation where my nemesis wound up being an orc named Kaka Giggles, which was absolutely hilarious, if nothing else. I did get a really big laugh out of it, so well played, I guess. But for every non-standard orc that is captains or war chiefs, basically what you want to do is get intel about them. You can do this by either finding intel or finding worms, as they're known, or orcs that can give you intel, dominating them with your brand or interrogations, and they're going to reveal that information because they have no choice, and that'll give you access to their strengths and weaknesses. This is going to determine how you fight those characters, which kind kind of bleeds into the combat section here. We have a variety of approaches available to us. Basically, your bow, stealth, your dagger, and regular old melee. You can also bring in wildlife like Caragors, Morgai flies, Graugs, and then you can also bring in other things like environmental effects in the form of stuff like burning and the like, or even poisoning food at a feast as an example. Basically, there's all sorts of ways to approach combat, and with these captains and war chiefs, more often than not, they are immune to certain types of combat. Some you cannot stealth attack, some you can't hit with ranged attacks, and so you have to learn that information and figure out the best way to go about approaching them. And then for like war chiefs, you can even turn their bodyguards against them once you draw them out, because they're not typically just around the way the captains are. Now, combine exploiting that system and its basics with a lot of the high-powered upgrades you're going to get, and suddenly you are off to the races with things like Shadow Strike, big area attacks, that kind of thing. Most of that stuff either revolves around elf shots, which is effectively the ethereal arrows that you have on you, allowing you to do things like Shadow Strike, which basically just teleports you to where the enemy is, which is very effective at getting you up on top of archers and things as you sort of parkour around. But then there's also your Hot Streak. Basically, if you can get a good hit streak going, your sword will start to glow, and that will typically be where you can empower things like executions and whatnot mid-combat if you have got the upgrades for it. So combat is simple, but they make it more interesting both through just straight up gameplay feel, by the way. While it's not a complicated or difficult system, it feels great to play, which is important, and combine that with having to like pick out your approach and play these orcs off of each other lest you die. And that specific set of like combat and interaction is really the highlight of this game. It's the stuff it does extremely well. And if you don't like that, honestly, the game's probably not for you. Which finally brings us to the DLC. So there's 3 big bits of DLC. These days, if you buy the game, you're going to buy the Game of the Year edition at the same time, which includes all of the DLC, so you'll get it by default. I actually had to pick up the upgrade because I did not have it personally, because I never bought those DLCs. But the big ones are actually what you'll play from the main menu. So 2 of them are like new mini campaigns, one in each area of the default. That is the Lord of the Hunt and the Bright Lord. On top of that, there's also the Trials of War. The Trials of War are basically just the things with like modifiers and stuff, extra challenges you can take on, and kind of just test your knowledge of the system. Really, the 2 big ones to talk about are then Lord of the Hunt and Bright Lord. Lord of the Hunt is really fun because it adds a bunch of, for that campaign, interactions with the wildlife, like different variations of Karagath and Graugs as an example. Like the Karagaths can perform like sneak attacks and stuff from stealth, which is not something the Karagors could do, and there's just different ways to interact with the animals. And I personally really enjoyed that. If I'm being honest, even just from a memory standpoint, my favorite thing about this game was actually the Lord of the Hunt DLC campaign. The other side of that, though, is actually the Bright Lord DLC. So the Bright Lord DLC is all about Celebrimbor and Sauron. Basically, a little mini-war that happened between them as they fought for control of the One Ring. This is cool because you play as Celebrimbor, yes, but it also introduces the power of the One Ring, which turns your ability to dominate and brand orcs up to 11. It is extraordinarily strong, and once you charge up the One Ring by branding enemies and everything, you'll get like unlimited access to things like either executions, more branding, things like that, and it's just a really fun, overpowered way to play a game you are already pretty overpowered in. And honestly, the story is pretty cool, and you obviously encounter Sauron at the end of it, which was fun, and this was the one I had not played previously, and while it's relatively short, I finished this in I think like 3 hours, it was still enjoyable for that time. That, though, finally brings us to the Steam Deck. The funny thing about this game is, at the time it released in 2014, the recommended specs for the game were actually a bit lower than what the Steam Deck has a rough equivalent of now, meaning that the Steam Deck actually has more hardware power than you would need to run this game, and as a result, it runs very, very well there. I have seen reports of some people having some issues with like crashing and things, but I never experienced that. It's also got controller support, cloud saves, all that usual stuff. Some people prefer to play these types of games with a controller, in fact, which is something to know. So if you're looking to play this on that platform, and given its shorter nature and the way the battles work, you may well want to, it's certainly a way to go. Which brings us to our positives and negatives, then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, really the Nemesis system, the main reason people are more than likely playing this game. It's such an innovative idea that unfortunately never got used anywhere else, but I remember people being so stoked about that combat system because of what it could potentially add to other games after its successful sort of prototyping here. And unfortunately, that just never happened, but what makes it especially interesting in Mordor as opposed to War is that in Mordor, it's kind of a little more reined in and easier to engage with quickly to get an idea of what it is, as War adds a significant amount of depth to it. On top of that, this game feels great to play outside of like movement. The actual actions you take, the back and forth of the combat system, while not really difficult or particularly challenging, anything like that, it just feels really great. It feels brutal. There's a lot of weight to it when you're dismembering these orcs, as an example. And between how this game feels to play on top of the Nemesis system, those are like the main reasons you would play it. Unfortunately, there are plenty of negatives, starting with the movement. Oftentimes, it kind of feels like you are trying to maneuver an 18-wheeler, especially if you're riding like a Caragor, as an example. They sometimes just really don't like to turn, or they try to climb up or down everything. It's also possible to get stuck on stuff really, really easily, and combine that movement with like constant interruptions from things like the captains, etc., who have to like call out to your character when they enter the battlefield for these like cinematic moments, and I get what they were going for there, but sometimes it's annoying. On top of that, you've got a story that was clearly designed just to introduce the Nemesis system to you, which means it feels overall, outside of the stuff directly about Italian, a little on the lackluster side, and the lack of difficulty options outside of just, adding something with like the trial system, which doesn't really add too much either. And so in basically every aspect outside of the Nemesis system, it's just kind of run-of-the-mill. Which brings me to my conclusion, which is basically the same thing. The Nemesis system is the reason to play this game. Even now, I think the reason you would play Mordor first as opposed to Shadow of War is that you can get a good idea of what the system was all about without having to deal with all of the stuff that War added, which really fleshes a lot of it out, adds like these sieges and stuff that can get a little out of hand if you're not in it to win it. Combine all of that with the fact that these days this game is quite cheap, so you can buy the Game of the Year edition full base price these days for about $20 US, which is cheap enough, I think, for what you're getting on its own. However, it's also, because it's so old, pretty regularly on sale. And so whether you're just looking for something to do over a weekend and you've got $20, or if you want to catch it on sale and just see what the Nemesis system is all about for yourself, I think Shadow of War is absolutely worth playing in that context. But I think more than anything, it's a game that is remembered more for the promise of what this game could lead to potentially that then unfortunately never really happened. And as a sort of video game historical context, it can be worth it in that sense as well. And obviously I'd recommend it just for that. Speaking of, I will get around to Shadow of War eventually. That one is going to take a bit longer. I did not leave much with Mordor undone when I stopped playing it last time, whereas when I play through Shadow of War, that game is just longer, so replaying it will take longer as well, but there's also online stuff I'll have to do, and there's also DLC there I never played as well, so that will altogether be a larger undertaking all told, whereas Mordor, thanks to its size, wound up being a very quick project for me, but eventually I will cover its sequel as well. But for the time being, that is pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.